I've never believed in ghosts, and even more so in the scary stories that people like to scare each other with in the kitchen at night. My job has never allowed me to indulge in fantasies. I was engaged in architectural expertise, dismantled collapsed buildings, checked old houses, bit into the history of plaster, and shone through the ceilings to the fittings. Every crack in a wall, every rustle had an explanation. I was sure of it, until he started a renovation project for an old residential complex on the outskirts. The house stood by the road on a small hill with a good view of the forest belt and the dry channel of the ditch. It was a typical multi-section block built in the 50s with 3 floors, cracked steps, and long dark corridors. The complex was abandoned in the early 2000s, and since then it has stood like a skeleton against the sky. Local teenagers would sneak in there to smoke and throw bottles at the windows, but none of the adults stayed inside for more than a couple of minutes. I needed to conduct an inspection of the structures. The order came from a private developer who bought the site along with the construction. I arrived there early in the morning with a thermal camera, a laptop, a flashlight, and a tablet with BTI plans. I left the car at the barrier, which someone broke down, and threw into a ditch. The air smelled of damp and old metal, as if everything here had been rusting for a long time, not only from the outside, but also from the inside. I entered the first entrance. The ceiling was low, and the stairs were crooked. The walls are peeling green paint, exposing the concrete in places. The smell in the entryway was suffocating, a mixture of mold, cat urine, and something else, elusive, like a musty memory. I moved from floor to floor, taking measurements, photographing, noting cracks. Everything was familiar, but every time I went up the stairs, it seemed to me that someone was quietly walking behind me, not breathing. It was worth stopping. Silence. I chalked it up to echo and paranoia. Old buildings always create the feeling that you're not alone, even though it's just acoustics. On the second floor, I looked into the first apartment on the left. The door was hanging on one hinge, and when I gave it a little push, it creaked and fell off, hitting the floor with a thud. Inside, everything was covered with newspapers. Not windows, but walls. It was like someone was trying to hide from something outside. The newspapers were old, yellowed, and dated 20 years ago. I took off a couple of sheets. There was a layer of foam and plaster under them. Someone deliberately sealed everything up as best they could. There was a worn sofa with burnt upholstery in the corner, and children's shoes were neatly placed next to each other on the windowsill. When I turned on the thermal imager, the device started flashing and making a strange sound, as if someone was interfering with its operation. A blur flashed in the camera for a second, like a silhouette, but without a head. I blinked and looked again, but it was empty. I checked the sensors and everything was working. I chalked it up to a glitch, but I still became more attentive. The next apartment was on the corner. When I opened the door, there was a pungent smell of burning, like after a bonfire. In one of the rooms, I found a burnt-out armchair and a bedside table with a notebook on it. The handwriting was neat and printed. I opened it at random and read. I see them every day. They don't look at me. They just stand there. I do not know if they are real, but they appear on stairs, in doors, in the reflections of windows, as if they hadn't left, or they stayed waiting. I closed the notebook. Someone was clearly suffering from paranoia. Still, the words left an unpleasant aftertaste. I continued my rounds, fixing the technical condition, but now I listened to every creak. The basement was unexpectedly open. The heavy hatch, rusted at the edges, was simply lifted and pushed aside. It was dark and damp inside. I wasn't going to go in there. The basement wasn't part of the survey plan. But as I stepped back, I noticed footprints by the door. Not just dirt, but fresh boot prints. Someone went down there recently. Very recently. When I returned to the exit, a woman was standing on the landing. She was wearing a simple gray coat with wet hair, as if she had just been caught in the rain. She looked straight at me, not saying a word. I froze. "Excuse me, who are you?" I asked. She didn't say anything. She just walked around me, slowly, without looking up. When I went outside, no one was there. Not on the stairs, not at the entrance. I walked around the building. Empty. Later, I asked about this woman from a local security guard who was on duty nearby, in a booth at the transformer station. He shrugged his shoulders. No one has lived there for 5 years. No one can be there. Only if these, what's their name, are looters. But a woman? In a coat? Oh, come on. I took the materials and made a report, but something has changed since that day. Sometimes I woke up at night with the feeling that someone was standing in the room. Sometimes I heard creaks in my apartment that didn't exist before. And then the dreams began. The same ones. I'm going back to that apartment. Newspapers, boots, silhouettes in the thermal imager, and a woman. It's always the same, silently watching as if she knows me. And he's waiting. I was trying to get my mind off it. He went to work, drank at a bar near his house in the evenings, and slept with the TV on. But no matter how tired I got, every time I closed my eyes, I saw the same image, a woman in a gray coat. She didn't do anything, just stood there or walked slowly towards me, looking past me. And every time there is the same background, peeling walls, a long corridor, light from the windows, as if penetrating through thick old curtains. I started to wake up in a sweat, with the feeling that someone had just stood by the bed. He stood motionless, without observing. I just was. The dream was merging with reality. At first, I thought it was stressful. This has happened before, hard work, little sleep, nerves. But now I began to notice other oddities. In the car, when driving along the highway, sometimes it seemed that someone was sitting in the back seat. It looks like a silhouette in the rearview mirror. I immediately turned around, no one. He stopped on the side of the road once, got out, and opened all the doors. Empty, not a trace. No paper, no smell, nothing. One day, returning from a facility, I stopped at a gas station. While I was paying for the coffee, the cashier looked at me and asked, "Are you taking someone with you?" I froze, not knowing what to say. "What do you mean?" I asked. It seemed to me that someone got out of the car with you." She shrugged her shoulders. "A girl, I think. But I could be wrong." I didn't say anything. He got out, quickly got behind the wheel, and drove away. There was movement in the mirror again. I didn't turn around. 2 weeks later, I was called back to the same facility. It was necessary to carry out an additional check of the basement level. The customer was going to use part of the space for a warehouse, and it was necessary to make an assessment. I didn't want to go back there. At all. But he couldn't refuse. It was part of the contract. I arrived a little later than usual, in the early evening, when the sun was already setting. The building still stood in silence, as if it had died out, as if it had been squeezed out from inside. I went to the entrance door, the same smell, the same walls, the same burnt-out steps. When I went down to the basement, the first thing I felt was damp and cold. The air was dense, as if with an admixture of dust, although there was no visible suspension in it. I immediately heard the drops. Rare death. Somewhere behind, to the left, because of the pipe. I turned on the flashlight. The walls were damp and peeling. The electrical wiring has long been cut off. There was an old cupboard in one corner, covered with mold. I got closer and noticed that there was an inscription on the door, scratched with something sharp. The handwriting was uncertain, like that of a man who wrote in a hurry. "Don't hide here. They remember." I recoiled, feeling the skin on my back grow cold. That them again. It's the same as in that notebook. It's like repeating the same scenario, just not made up. The note wasn't old. The edges were fresh. The wood had been scratched recently. I took a couple pictures, quickly checked the overlaps, and made notes. I wanted to leave as soon as possible, but when I turned around, I heard footsteps. Somewhere in the dark, not behind, but to the side, in the far corridor of the basement. Barely audible, as if someone was stepping on a stone, in socks. I froze listening. The light of a lantern jumped from wall to wall. Nothing, but the sound didn't stop. I didn't know what to do. Should I call someone? Check it out? Or just leave? My heart was pounding in my throat, but I took a step forward. Then another one. I needed to know. I had to make sure it was just drops. Just an echo. Just rats. I went out into a side corridor. Pipes hung from the ceiling, and water dripped from one. There's an old fire alarm on the wall that hasn't been working for a long time. And there, at the end of the corridor, there was a flash of movement. Someone slipped from one room to another. I rushed over there. Without thinking, I just walked, feeling the cold squeeze my skin. I ran into the room and saw someone standing at the window. In a gray coat. My hair is wet. You can't see the face. I wasn't breathing. "Who are you?" I asked. She didn't answer. She turned to me, took a step forward, and walked past me. Not a glance, not a gesture. She went out into the hallway. I ran after her, but when I ran out, the hallway was empty. Just drops, only the hum of empty pipes. And everything. I searched all the rooms. To no avail. When I went outside, it was already getting dark. The wind blew dust across the asphalt, catching pieces of debris. I got into the car, gripped the steering wheel, and sat there until the shaking in my hands subsided. Several months have passed since then. The job started to decline, and I started avoiding new orders. I felt like I was turned off. I started writing so I wouldn't go crazy. He wrote about every sensation, every creak, every dream. Every time I saw her, on the street, in the reflection of the window, in the shadow of the elevator, she didn't disappear. It doesn't disappear. It's just there. And the strangest thing is that I started to get used to it, that I began to get used to it, not in the sense of resigned, but as if a second line of perception appeared inside me, where her presence became part of reality, like rain outside the window or dust on the windowsill. She was there always. Sometimes I could smell her, an old wool smell, like an old coat that had been hanging in the closet for too long. Sometimes I get the feeling that someone walked by, brushed my shoulder, but there was no one else in the room except me. The neighbors began to notice that I was different. Someone said that I looked tired. Someone said that I look at people strangely, as if I'm not quite there. An old man who lived on the floor below once asked me in the elevator if she was cold. I looked at him like he was crazy, but he continued, "The one who walks with you. She's so quiet," all in his coat. And he just walked out, leaving me standing in the elevator, as if in a box with air soaked in silence. I didn't bother to find out what he meant. I didn't want to know. Sometimes ignorance is the only thing that keeps a person from finally breaking down. But damn it, every day I realized, it's not my game anymore. It's something that follows my trail like a stray dog. It doesn't bark, it doesn't rush, it just goes. And the longer I was silent, the closer she got. I started looking for old cases related to this house, this neighborhood. In the local library, in the archives, even from an old realtor who worked back in the days when houses were built from real bricks, not drywall and illusions. We managed to find several missing persons cases. Almost everything is without a trace. Most of them are young women. Several were actively searched for, and there were even newspaper clippings, old and yellowed. I came across a photo in one of the cases. The picture was indistinct, as if it had been zoomed in from a surveillance camera or old photographic film. A woman in a gray coat standing at the entrance. Damn it, I recognized that coat. On the back of the picture was a handwritten inscription. No one knows who she is. She just shows up. It's always close to disappearing. My heart sank. It was the first time I felt not fear, but rage. I wanted to understand. I wanted to know why she was following me. What did I do? Why choose me? Or was I just there when I shouldn't have been? I went back to that house. At night. I don't know what exactly pushed me. Perhaps desperation, perhaps insomniac anger. I didn't bring a flashlight. I didn't call anyone. I just walked in the dark, stepping on familiar stairs, inhaling the smell of damp concrete, listening to the creaking of doors. On the 4th floor, the door to one of the apartments was ajar. I've never noticed her before. Inside, there was nothing but old furniture, newspapers on the floor, and an overturned chair. And there are pictures on the wall. Real. Fixed with buttons, like in some kind of crime novel. People. Different faces. Men, women. Children. And in every picture, she's somewhere in the background. Always out of focus. Always slightly to the side. But she is. The same pose. The same coat. I saw myself in one photo. Sitting in a cafe. Outside the window. Daylight falls on me. I'm holding my phone, not looking at the camera. The picture was clearly taken secretly, and there's a reflection in the glass behind me. Her reflection. I couldn't breathe. I stood clutching this picture until the paper began to crumple from the moisture of my palms. I started to look around the apartment. There was an old desk in one of the rooms and a notebook on it. The handwriting is sprawling and nervous. The first records were dated many years ago. Someone described the meetings. Briefly at first, then more often. The recordings became shorter and more desperate. One entry was repeated several times. If you've seen her, then you're already inside the circle. And there is no way out. Just silence. Only loneliness. I wanted to burn down this apartment. I wanted to rip out those pictures, throw everything to hell, forget. But I realized that I had gone too far. I wasn't looking for the truth. I was just trying to breathe in a room where there was no more air. I didn't turn on the light on the way home. I walked through the streets, catching every noise, listening to every step. He stopped at the entrance. I looked up and there was a light on in my apartment window. Although I definitely didn't leave it. I didn't go in. I just sat on the bench. I still had that picture in my pocket. I looked at her over and over again. There was something else. Something I hadn't noticed before. Behind my back, in the reflection, it's not just her. Something else was reflected on the glass. Word, scratched on the glass. I enlarged the photo. Stay. I didn't want to go home, but I knew that home wasn't a place where I was alone anymore. I got up anyway, probably out of stubbornness, or because no matter how it sounded, I didn't care anymore. No matter what happens, I'm tired of running. I'm tired of half-truths, of rustling behind my back, of this exhausting game of catching up with the very shadow of my life. I went to the apartment door and did not immediately insert the key. My heart was pounding, as if someone else was hiding behind it. Scared, confused, not me. The lock clicked and I opened the door. Inside, everything looked normal. Too much, actually. Everything was in its place. The jacket is on the back of a chair. The keys are in a ceramic cup at the entrance. But the kitchen light was still on, and someone had left a pot of boiling water on the stove. I walked over. The water has boiled off. The bottom has already started to burn. I definitely didn't do that. It wasn't forgetfulness. It was someone's presence. I walked around the apartment, cautiously, silently, checking room by room. But no one, not a sound, no movement. It just feels like I'm not alone in this silence anymore. There was a note on the desk. Plain, crumpled paper. I unwrapped it. His hand was shaking. The handwriting was the same as in the notebook from that apartment. You let me in, then only down. I didn't understand what down meant. I didn't have any stairs or a basement, only the balcony. And I went to him like it was the only logical solution. He opened the door and went out. The cold air hit my face, but everything in my head was electrified. The city below me was familiar and calm, and it seemed as if nothing had changed. Only inside, everything was crumbling, breaking, cracking. In the reflection of the glass door, I saw that I wasn't alone. And he didn't turn around. Not out of fear. Just why? I already knew. It wasn't her. Not the woman with the coat. It was something else much simpler, more real. Something that I have allowed into my life. Loneliness. Loss. The inability to let go. I haven't really talked to anyone for months. He was shutting himself off. I was looking for someone or something that would explain my fears. Instead, I became a part of them myself. Those faces in the photos, maybe they were looking for answers too. Maybe they also thought it was something external. And the truth was simple. We don't die for meeting someone. We're dying of emptiness. I went back into the room, sat down. He stared at the ceiling. There was a noise from below. Someone slammed the door. Someone shouted. Life continued around me, but not in me. I realized that the story I was looking for was my story. The wrong woman, not the disappearances. I'm the one who disappeared. Gradually, quietly, the way it happens to people who are no longer needed even by themselves. And so I'm writing this, not as a warning, and not as a confession. It's just because at some point you have to tell, not out loud, to myself, or the emptiness behind my back, so that there would be at least some kind of line, so that someone would see and understand someday.